Okay, I'm turning on the video unit for the iTV studio. And I see it says that it's trying to set up the ability to stop, so it should be broadcasting. And what I'll do is look at the screen at the back of the room and see if we seem to be on with the iTV studio. Let's just go to the, drop off our counter and go to the overhead camera and show you what I'm seeing down here. The video for the iTV studio is showing an old frame, whereas the video for the Facebook stream is showing us, you see the table is in the shot, and I'm moving it, and it is active. So in a few minutes, we're now 14 minutes to airtime, I'll turn on the Facebook closer to the start of time, and we see that this one is not working really. It says it's live, and it says stop, but I'm not seeing it on my rear screen. Let me show you that for a moment by going to camera 1, and you see in the distance that the backhaul for iTV Studio is still stuck on a frame. Normally that starts when a live stream starts, but for the coming back to camera 6 for a moment overhead. This screen should be showing something live, just like the video that's streaming to Facebook at the moment. For some reason, this isn't working. I could stop it and start again, but all the indications are that it's streaming. I'll just take a walk up to the screen and see if I can kick that into starting again, just in case it's my laptop that's doing the backhaul at the back of this room. Okay, well, I'm actually going to be broadcasting in 5 minutes. I'm actually trying to go on right now, but this guy is not telling me I'm backhaul. Let's see what I can do. No sign of it. Says it's live. Screen health is question mark. Elapsed time 2 minutes 36. Nobody's watching. It's funny because I'm not watching. Not clear that I can do anything to kick this into working. But it does think it's streaming. So maybe we will have something to show. Stream live 74 minutes ago. That doesn't seem to be correct. Screen health is good. Live. Screen health is good. Back. That is studio live. Channel settings. I'm not getting anything here that looks like we're live, but maybe this is it. We are in fact now live. As with the normal delay. Let's try to go to full screen. That will change things. And something like this might take us to full screen. There's a full screen view. They're definitely live. Over here on the Facebook, we'll see that possibly live later, but that doesn't work for me yet. Okay, we're counting down at 30 minutes, and I'll take a little quick break right here. Okay. Okay, I'm back. Let's go to camera 3. Hello.
Five minutes.
5 minutes, yes. Look up at the screen, Rob. See me on that right screen? That's my YouTube screen. I went over there and I kicked it and I pushed it around. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
See, that is me talking to you right there. Look at that screen I'm saying.
Yeah, this is immediate and that one's got a little delay.
Exactly. So that's good. What happened here, Rob, is this controller for that video unit is saying it's live, and it was true, it was, but when I went up there, it wasn't showing up. So every other time I've done this, as soon as I started it here, it replaced the static screen that said the live stream is over, and it started streaming. This time it didn't, so that's not reliable. Either I have to give up with that, or I have to go over there before the program, here I am 4 minutes, and make it work. Now the one on the second screen, you see me there, that one,
What are you talking about?
doesn't matter. I want to just tell you the second screen is Facebook, it never starts. So I definitely need someone else to start it if I want to see myself up there.
It only takes a manual.
On
thing to
manual,
start it.
yeah. The other one from YouTube, 3 or 4 times out of 5, it actually started up there so I could see it was live.
So you
But
can manually start it a couple minutes before.
well, then I have to edit off the piece at the beginning, or maybe I
No,
don't.
you don't. If you're just streaming it, you just hit start streaming.
Yes, I do that, but then
Running.
the program is longer than it needs to be. Of course, if it says this on it,
Exactly.
people can say, oh, I've got to go ahead 4 minutes to get to the start of the program, and that's maybe what I'll wind up doing.
Yeah, as long as it's short, like within a few minutes, then it's fine.
Yeah, so maybe I should start Facebook right now. Let me
Yeah.
show you something else, though.
Right.
Come on over here. It just helps me to tell you, even though you don't understand it. The point is that it always looked like this. You see, this is a few seconds behind, and
yeah.
it's intermittent because it's a copy of what's going on. This is the Facebook one at the moment, though. That's not running right now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to start it, though. See, it says here it's ready to go.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to start Facebook.
Broadcast.
And just touch that.
Yeah.
See it start. Now this one says it's live, and it says it can be stopped because it is live. But it's
Why is it
not
looking at
showing
that
the
screen?
current video.
Looking at that
This
screen,
has been on this screen since I came down this morning. For some reason, it's not getting the copy of, it hasn't gotten hot over here yet, but I have my, okay, you hear what I'm saying, right?
Yes.
There's something wrong with this. You
Yes.
can't count on this app running on the iPad to give an accurate story. So now it's saying live, and this one is still saying ready.
It looks, look, you got it. It's going, isn't it?
Where do you see it
Screen
go?
3.
Screen 3 is me. That's
Oh,
live.
okay.
That's,
So that's screen 2, which is Facebook.
yeah,
So that's not. showing
sorry.
it.
This is Facebook at the moment. I've labels are all wrong, and this is my YouTube. It says it right here.
I can see that that's YouTube, and I can see that that's Facebook.
Correct.
Which one is number 2 over there?
That one, the one that's static blue. It's just that's the one from yesterday. So
I mean, which source is that? YouTube or Facebook?
Facebook, CCTV, Facebook, my real screen, real time, and then YouTube. That's the way it is. They're alphabetical
so
order.
Facebook is not showing. It says it's broadcasting. but
No, it
that-
doesn't say it's broadcasting, Rob.
What?
It says it's ready to
Oh yeah,
broadcast.
you hit the button. It didn't.
I'll
go,
hit it
didn't
again.
engage. Right.
It did, but then it didn't go. These are things I have to learn. Over here, when it does go, what it does is it stops saying broadcast or trying to broadcast, and it says live, and it says now stop, and it indicates that I could stop the live broadcast.
Yeah, it looks like that one.
It just did
Now
go
has the
live.
stop option.
Okay, so you can go over there and refresh that second page for me.
I have to refresh it?
Somehow, it's the laptop on the left, it's the red mouse, and it's a screen which you can get the mouse up to that screen and see if you can, okay, I've got 1 minute to start, so you do whatever you can. Just click on that movie or try to refresh the page, find out what's possible. All right, I'm counting down 1 minute 24 seconds, 1 minute 23 seconds. One last sip. It would be great to have proof that a video is going up to Facebook. It thinks it's going to Facebook here, so I'm encouraged by that. Right, so see if you can do anything to find live. I'm supposed to be looking at Facebook Live. 35 seconds. I go 3 key to start, so key 3 to turn off. Feel like I'm missing something, but I'm not sure what it is.
Got it.
Very good, Rob. Says it's starting in 10 seconds.
The same delay as the one over there. You're actually 7, 6, 5, but there's about a 10-second delay before it goes to YouTube and Facebook.
Okay, please be quiet now. Welcome to Information Philosopher. I'm Bob Doyle, webcasting from my iTV studio in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm hoping to reach philosophers and scientists around the world to help solve several great problems in philosophy, in physics, in biology, and in psychology. The key to finding solutions is to understand the physical, even the metaphysical nature of information. Information is a physical thing, but it is not made of material. We live in the information age, but few philosophers understand that information is neither matter nor energy. Information needs matter to be embodied, in our brains, for example, and it needs energy to be communicated, like this lecture coming to you over the internet. But matter and energy may be conserved. The total amount of matter and energy today is the same as there was at the origin of the universe, billions of years ago. But if the stuff of the material world is a constant amount, what accounts for all the change that we see, the new things under the sun? What is changing is the information, which is not conserved. Information has been increasing since the beginning of time, despite the second law of thermodynamics. The changes are in the arrangement of the matter into what we call information structures, like the galaxies and stars and planets. Living things, you and I, are dynamic and growing information structures. Living things, all living things, are forms through which matter and energy flow continuously. And it is information processing from the DNA in our cells to the thinking in our minds that controls those flows of matter and energy. I hope to show that information is the modern spirit, the ghost in the machine, the mind in the body. It's the soul. And when we die, it's our information that perishes. Only our matter remains. Information philosophy is a dualist philosophy, including both an immaterial aspect to the world as well as the material aspect. And it can solve many problems, which I hope to introduce to you. Okay, so this is a practice version of my 1-hour lectures that I will be presenting on the web, so that there's a third component to my work of the last couple decades to discuss great problems in philosophy, in physics, in biology, and psychology. Let me give you a look at this book of mine, and just press this number 3 here, and it should home in on that book. This Great Problems of Philosophy and Physics Solved has a big red question mark, because it's only proposed solutions that I'm hoping to find. The way I've done my work, beginning in the early 21st century, was to create a website. And that website has now many different pages on these problems. So give me a moment and I'll try to drive to my Information Philosopher website, and here it is. Let me go to the home page and show it to you. The website has resulted from studying a very, very large number of philosophers, which are down the left-hand side of the page. To show them a little more clearly, why don't I just expand this a little bit, more than a little bit, and show you the philosophers that I've read about and written about. My goal here was to study the work of other great thinkers from the earliest times. Here's Cicero, and back in the, just before the Christian era, the Common Era. And here's Chrysippus, who was a couple centuries nearby. And there are many modern philosophers. Each one of them I read in order to find out the core thinking they've given us that applies to the situations we're in today. Surprisingly, some philosophers, notably the great Epicurus and the Latin philosopher Lucretius, who wrote about Epicurus, are applicable today. Much of their thinking is getting close to our best modern thinking on the subjects. Okay, let me back out again from this and take you to the navigational structure of my website, because in writing so many things for so many years, there's a great deal here, and I've tried to organize it. There are drop-down menus that are introductory sections on the different parts of my website, and then much more specific things. One on the area of the problem of knowledge, or epistemology it's called. One on values. Are there objective values in the universe, or is everything of value just something that human beings have decided to call valuable or good as opposed to evil? A very large part of my work early on was devoted to the problem of free will. And so here's the page on the problem of free will. There's a long history. I have my own model of how it works, and we have some evidence from neuroscience about that. But let me just for a moment break back to my book on great problems, and let me put it aside for a moment and show you that my first book in 2011 was this free will book, which summarized all of the work on my website up until that time in 2011. And I called it a scandal in philosophy for an important reason. I wasn't the only one who thought there were scandalous aspects to it. One of those who also thought so was John Searle. His notion of it being a scandal was that after all the centuries of writing about free will, we have not made very much progress. And what I've done in this book, and initially on my website, is to look through all the centuries, recounting the different forms of determinism that were used to deny human freedom and responsibility. The idea of determinism is such an old idea because it was, even the early Greeks thought there must be causal rules by which things happen. And when the laws of nature came to be refined, especially in the time of Isaac Newton, it seemed as if all things in the world seemed to rely on a relationship, a causal relationship with things that went on in the past. This is the notion of what's called a Laplacian universe, and that if an intelligence, a great, perhaps a godlike figure, had the knowledge of what existed at any moment in time, that the laws of nature could give us what will happen at any other time in the future. So even many defenders of free will, and there aren't really that many who defend it as strenuously as I'm going to try to do with you, think that it's really a metaphysical mystery, one that can't be simply explained by having it, basing it on other unintelligible mysteries such as quantum mechanics, which is a very important one to me, or making it an equally mysterious gift of God. So this book is an introduction to the freedom section of the Information Philosopher website. Let's go back to that website and see that that book is really a printed version of all of these sections in the free will section of my website. I also have a section on the mind and the mind-body problem and mental causation, other very interesting problems, which will be the subject of my my fifth book. The one I'm working on now, which is my fourth, I'll introduce you to in a moment. I have a section on chance, the role of chance and statistical thinking in physics today, but it's often been thought of earlier. And I have a very large section on quantum mechanics. My own work at Harvard, my PhD in 1968, was on quantum physics, actually the interaction of hydrogen atoms, the very simplest form of atom, with radiation. And I will show that the interaction of radiation and matter leads to results that are not predictable and are, in principle, indeterministic outcomes when one atom collides with another atom. I showed that in the case of two simple hydrogen atoms. So there's a long section here, and this will turn out to be part of my fourth book, which will look at the career of Albert Einstein and show that while Einstein was regarded as one of the greatest critics of quantum mechanics, in fact, 20 years before quantum mechanics, great thinkers like Werner Heisenberg and Niels Bohr and others, Einstein had come across the key concepts or ideas, or perhaps invented or discovered principles of quantum mechanics, but he's rarely appreciated as having done that. So while I'm talking about the website, let me point out some important sections of it. First of all, there's a citation for those of you who want to be scholarly and might want to write something about what's on this website. You can simply click on the Cite This page, and what we see is a citation in APA style, which tells you you can simply take this and copy it and paste it into your article or your own web work. Second thing I'd like to show you is that besides all the pages on philosophers and besides all the pages on specific problems, what I have here, in order to get to it, I've got to sort of close this little citation page, is I have what I call a basic glossary of all the terms, the technical jargon used by philosophers to discuss many of the subjects. Primarily the question of free will and determinism and something on mind-body. But each one of these technical terms is defined here, and it's more than just defined in the sense that we got a straight definition of the idea of actualism. Actualism is a very important set of thinking that denies that there are multiple possible futures. It grows out in modern times from Albert Einstein's special relativity that makes the future just another fourth dimension along with the three spatial dimensions. This idea that the only thing that can happen and will happen in the future is events that are in some sense already out there. And so you cannot change the future, as Dan Dennett says, to something else. He jokes, change it from what to what? Well, in my view, the future is indeterminate, and it can be many possible futures, and physical events lead to one rather than another, but most importantly, human beings can change the future in the sense that they think among the alternative possibilities for themselves, and they choose one of them, and that's the future that we have. We, as human beings, are involved in creating our own future. So you see, under the definition of actualism, we see many related pages on the website, or many related concepts. So if I click on alternative possibilities, it moves down in my glossary to describe alternative possibilities. Now, that means that there's massive hyperlinking in the glossary, so that any particular topic you look up, you not only get a definition, but you get the links to the things that are related to it. And if we were to come back to alternative possibilities for just a moment, you'd see that we can also go to the page on the website that describes alternative possibilities, or you can just search the whole website. So let me just show you what happens when we do a search, for example. Now it's saying, it's using Google to search alternative possibilities on this website. And we find the page on alternative possibilities, the page on the Princeton philosopher Harry Frankfurt, who denied that there are alternative possibilities, and that couldn't be the case. He tried to show that all the possibilities are really only one, and that's consistent with what's called compatibilism. Now you'll see the search brings up many other people. It brings up David Biederker, it brings up Bob Kane, who's a major libertarian who wants to show that there are alternative possibilities, and that's part of the story of free will. A related concept is that you and I could have done otherwise, and not just do the one thing that the actualists think is going to be done in your future life. The way Dan Dennett believes that this is a non-issue. It's not important, this idea of being able to do otherwise. Here is more on Frankfurt and several other philosophers, including one of my few women philosophers, who discuss this subject. So let's go back out. I'm not sure how I get there, maybe by doing this. Here we are back in the glossary, and I can then also go back out to the main homepage here. Let's see now. I was hoping to tell you a few more things about the website before we move on to some discussion of the books that I hope you'll be interested in. One of the important things I've tried to do with the website is to provide you with resources. Okay, let me come back here to myself for a moment. As a scholar, and a very lucky one, because I still have my academic connections to Harvard University, because of that, I'm able to go online through our great library system at Harvard, and many other academics have this same capability, and I can go and look into a particular person's work and find their articles. Modern philosophers especially have published most of their work in a very large number of somewhat obscure journals. And sometimes those papers contain the key ideas that I would like to be able to fully understand and decide whether we can agree with that or we find there's something wrong with that. But I can't expect you to understand the depths of my argument unless I do my best to present the arguments of these other thinkers. And how best to do that? Well, each web page I write, I present that philosopher's or scientist's thinking. But in order to convince you, I do two things. First of all, I usually quote the words, paragraphs, sometimes pages, and sometimes very lengthy excerpts from the works of the philosophers and scientists that are on my Information Philosopher website. But to go even further, I've decided what I will do is download PDFs of those critical articles and make them available so you can just read the entire piece of work done by someone. Let's, as an example, I'd like to show you the work of William James. Let's take a quick look at William James because he's one of my heroes, a 19th century thinker who, in my mind, was the first to make a defense of free will. You see, what he did initially was just to say, I will just believe my will is free. And by doing so, he then changed his whole psychology. This master of psychology who created the great textbook on psychology in the 19th century, and this changed his life. And so it was a very positive experience for him. But he went on to give us an idea of free will, which is the basis for my own thinking on free will, basing it essentially on alternative possibilities being generated in our minds. I'll be giving you a lot more on this subject of free will, of course, but what I want to do is use this page on James as an example. You see large paragraphs of James' own words, his own thinking. I've had to take those out of a book, and I scan the book usually, and then I turn it into HTML coded text so it shows up on a web page. There's a good deal of that, but there are times when you would rather, I hope, or be willing to join me as someone working deeply on these problems in philosophy and physics to know exactly what he said in the original work. And here's an example of such links. Here's an article he wrote in Mind in 1879 called Are We Automata? Are We Robots? Here's a wonderful, perhaps the single most important article that James wrote on the subject of free will called The Dilemma of Determinism. Here he is speculating on consciousness, which is, of course, an extremely important problem in modern times. And we'll have a whole section on consciousness in our Great Problems book, and later we'll have a book on the mind, which will even more deeply go into the question of consciousness. Here he is on the mind and its ideas. All very interesting articles. Here's one on the question of free will. Okay, so what we've got there is, let me take a quick look at just one of those. Let's go to the dilemma of determinism for a moment. And you see I've embedded that article inside the William James section. Notice my navigational tools here. I have the home page is here, then the section called Solutions for Philosophers and Solutions for Scientists, and then here's William James. Up in the head you'll see I've got actually a direct link to the glossary right here, and I am running a blog. I also have a iFi about my work here, and it tells you a large part of the backstory. Let me shrink this down a little bit, and things I've been able to do in the past. I'd like to tell you more about them because I think they'll help you to decide how much credence you can put in the work I'm doing. Let me just go back then to my blog for a moment, and let me make a comment about the difference between a website like Information Philosopher and a blog like my iFi blog. This blog I began back around 2007, but it has been having no new additions for the last six and a half years, as I put so much time into writing my books and enlarging my website. Years ago I wrote an article called When to Wiki and When to Blog. And I hope you understand that there's quite a difference between a wiki like Wikipedia, which we'll be using a lot in our lectures as I go to them for the best sort of biographical information about any given thinker, you know, their dates, where they went to school, what universities they were in, all of that stuff. It's been tempting to think of including that on my website for you, but Wikipedia has basically done all that, and that will enable you to go get it there if you, in your scholarly work or thinking, want to know who is a given scientist or philosopher. It's all there on the Wikipedia. So a wiki, like Wikipedia, is basically a knowledge base, a kind of a large picture of many things that are semi-organized or nicely organized, or as best as I can organize them on my Information Philosopher website into those drop-down menus. Let me go back to that for just a moment and show you again that my organization into sections and then particular broad areas like ethics or values, free will, quantum mechanics, and so forth, that's me organizing my website as a wiki, but a little bit beyond what you can get when you go into the Wikipedia. And then back to the blog, which is right here, where a wiki is a knowledge base and all of the organization of things is all out there at the same time. A blog is fundamentally like a diary. Its major dimension is time, so that when a new blog post is added to a blog, it becomes the item on the top. All the other blog posts are in reverse chronological order back into the beginning of the blog, which in my case was over 10 years ago. The only way you can then find out whether the blog has some important information is for you to search for it, either with a general search like the one I have on the Information Philosopher website, or using tagging in my blog case, where you actually will click on a concept like free will, and it will bring back a list of possible things, not necessarily organized as nicely as the Google search does. But that's the difference between a wiki. It's sort of all the information all out at one time and arranged by things that are related to one another, and a blog, which is a sequence of events in time. So you'll notice that on this blog, the menu drop-downs are a different color because I couldn't quite get the same dark blue coming down, but from the blog, I have links in these drop-down menus which will go right to the web pages on the Information Philosopher itself. So here's the introduction to the freedom section. Now, while I'm talking about Wikipedia and the great search ability that Google has given to us, I would just like to show you something. What if we put a search for just a particular philosopher? I'm going to enter here William James, for example. And this is a Google search for William James. Now the first thing that comes up, oh my goodness, it gives us not the William James the philosopher, but another one. So let me just take this out of here again and see if that happens the same thing. Or we could say William James psychology. And here we get the William James we're familiar with. And here's so the most important page that we often get is a Wikipedia page. Now in this case, the Wikipedia page is a few down because his page at Harvard is more important, and this contribution to the Britannica comes up second after the Harvard one, and Britannica actually is cited really right at the top of the things. So this here, it also on Wikipedia or on Google gives you several suggestions of what you might want to look for. in other kinds of questions you might ask. One of the things I like to do on Google itself, or let's go up to our location bar and type in something like information philosopher, and there it is coming up for us, so I can just slide over here, and it went directly to our website. That's not exactly what I wanted to have happen, so let me back it off to just information philosopher, and here's a search for information philosopher. That's a few items down in the Google suggestion. Let's try that for a moment. And I think this is a sort of interesting result. What Google does, instead of giving us one major link to me, which is my website on information philosophy, it gives us individual pages inside the website as well. And so that's rather nice. Here's my About Information Philosopher page and other pages that seem to be related to my work, including my two-stage model of free will, which we will be going into in the future. Okay, so the main thing I wanted you to get from my introduction to my website is that it has huge numbers of pages on thinkers, and then it has a very large number of pages on problems, which are a kind of a different dimension. And then finally, or an important element of it is that it's loaded with hyperlinks, so that any particular page you're on, you're encouraged to go take a look at another subject. In this case, here's a link to metaphysics. And that leads me to introduce to you another website of mine, which I built in connection with my third book. So let's take a moment and look at my third book here, which is called Metaphysics: Problems, Paradoxes, and Puzzles. The early metaphysics work began with Aristotle's books that were on the origin of the universe, on whether there's a God, and deep, deep questions that he thought were or modern thinkers who have organized Aristotle's work called these books on first things, on being itself, and other really deep questions. They organized his books in his collection as coming after physics. Metaphysics fundamentally means beyond physics, or you need to study physics first and then go down into these deeper questions of metaphysics. And that name is stuck, although you'll never find the word in Aristotle's books themselves. They're a collection of his problems, which are very, very deep problems. During the 19th century, metaphysics was still considered a very important subject, but in the 20th century, there came a time when problems like free will, the existence of the mind as something different from the body, were called metaphysical problems, and they had a very bad reputation. There wasn't much metaphysics published positively over those years, but it has had a resurgence, and a large part of the ancient work and the modern work is in my book on metaphysics. So let me just move down a little bit here and tell you where I'm going next. There's another important website we ought to know about, and I'm not sure I have a link to it right here. Well, first of all, let me come back a moment to metaphysics. In writing that book, I decided I ought to also perhaps have a website that's devoted to metaphysics, and I sort of coin a slightly different word. In English, a person who does metaphysics is called a metaphysician historically, and I prefer the term metaphysicist, which is what I call myself, just as I call myself an information philosopher. And the notion of a metaphysicist is one who not only argues, as today's academic philosophers do, from words, getting the correct concepts, defining concepts clearly, employing logical thinking and so forth to get to solving problems, this generally turned out to be a failure. In the 20th century, from the time of Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein, who came up with ideas about logical positivism, and in his later years, Wittgenstein changed his thinking and argued that he wasn't really getting to solve any problems. They talked in those days that they could dissolve problems, and by dissolving or dissolving them, they said they turned out these problems are not real problems in the world. They're pseudo problems and not worth thinking about. And then later Wittgenstein, he goes over to focusing on the fact that language philosophy, which had hoped to be analytical and able to solve problems because they had precise connections from the initial fundamentals of things that we could see and know to be true, and then build up the entire base of knowledge from these logical atomic ideas. That failed, and Wittgenstein came to view language as something in itself, a great tool, but not something that reaches unambiguous and perfect conclusions. And philosophy slipped into a kind of relativity, not the same relativity that Einstein had introduced. In fact, Einstein, reflecting on the use of his term relativity, was rather annoyed that it seemed to imply that our knowledge of the universe was not absolute knowledge, not objective knowledge, but it was relative, and maybe one person's view of the truth is only relative to another person's view and not anything absolute that binds the two of them to think the same way. And this caused a good deal of concern. It's my view that there are relative ideas, relative beliefs that are quite different from culture to culture, but that science, physics, and the hard sciences do get us to a situation of truth that is not relative to an individual thinker or even to a society or a culture, but they are ideas that are outside of culture that we all really ought to understand as the basis for our knowledge of the universe. So my work in both metaphysics, which is the deepest place to go to try to understand these great questions, all the way up to biology and psychology and philosophy, to me, it needs to be based on one firm idea, which I call information. That's why I'm called the information philosopher. And information is a very unusual, abstract thing. Many people think they're not sure they can define it, even in the information age, when information in the form of data in our computers and in our massive databases and in this ever-growing knowledge system, IBM's Watson and so forth, is growing and growing and growing. But what exactly is all that information? What is its, I say, what is its existential status? That is to say, does information exist? Do ideas exist? Was a great question asked by the very early Neoplatonic philosopher Porphyry, who said, do Plato's ideas exist? Plato, you'll recall, perhaps, believed the ideas had an existence which was even more basic than the phenomenal world around us, which was just an imitation of the ideas. The notion that a horse that we're walking around in the real world is just a rough approximation of the perfect idea of a horse. Well, that's a little difficult to understand, but he certainly, as a mathematician, thought that there was the notion of a perfect triangle or perfect circle. Then the question is, what about the circles we see around us? Since they're made out of matter, ink on paper, orbits of a planet around the sun, they are only approximations to the notion of a perfect circle. For example, does the perfect triangle have equal angles in all directions, or is it a right triangle? And these are great questions, which mostly are things that philosophers like to debate and teach in class and so forth, and we'll get to some of those. But the relationship between the material world and what from those early days of Platonic ideal world is called the dualist relationship between materialism and idealism. This is a problem of thinking, sometimes called dualism, a dualism that there might be a material world, the one we all see, and an ideal world. And the question is, what is the existential status? That is to say, do ideas really exist like the perfect triangle? Those are issues that come down in the 18th century to Immanuel Kant, who thought there might be a phenomenal world like the one we see around us that obeyed the laws of Newtonian physics, and there could be another world he called the noumenal world, which was somehow a world outside of the world of immediate experience, and in that world we were more free to do things than the world that he saw, the planets and the stars obeying, which was a world in which the laws of nature would tend to make everything completely determined because there would be a causal chain. This will be a very big theme in my work. Let me then go back here to our metaphysicist website, and I want to mention another very important website, which is not my work. Let me just click here to get a window and type in Plato. And with a little bit of luck, I will, nope, I don't get it, but I'll type .Stanford. Okay, ANFORD.org. This is Stanford University's, I guess I didn't get it in correctly. Should have set this up for it. Stanford Encyclopedia. Here's one called the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So let's go there. And like my website, the Stanford Encyclopedia has different sections which you're recommended you read, but let's go instead just to the main page and see that the way it works is it's completely based on a Google search-like interface. So we can type in here, let's do William James again. And we have a page on William James and just one. So let's take a look there. And what I'd like you to see is that when you read about William James, you can read about him on my website, you can read about him in the Wikipedia, and you can read about him on the Stanford Encyclopedia. Now, the important thing of the Stanford Encyclopedia is that it's usually written by a single scholar. And this one is quite wonderful and has all the details of his work. Let me just go to the end of it for a moment, take a quick look. You see this page was copyright 2017 by Russell Goodman, and here's a link to him at the University of New Mexico. The general format of Stanford Encyclopedia articles are that they are all the work of a single person, sometimes a couple. They usually have an extensive bibliography, but they don't have links to those articles the way I've provided them on my Information Philosopher website for your work. But they are wonderfully written and quite complete, though I find many times they basically are giving us standard views of academic philosophy, which I will challenge in many ways. But I will quite often refer to these pages. Let me go back to my own page, and let's go and visit many of my pages. At the bottom, I will include a link to the Stanford Encyclopedia page and sometimes a Wikipedia page. And let's see where we are. We're now 40-some minutes into this lecture. I'm going to streaming. We say we're live on both of the streams, so that's really good. When I did a test 2 days ago, my streaming appliances crashed and I wasn't able to complete an hour. I'm working towards being able to do this on a regular basis. Let me show you one more thing about website searches. I'd like to talk to you about specific problems, but I would also like to, let's just go to another search page, arbitrary page here, and put in Robert Cain, who is the philosopher that's been very important to me. Let's hope we get the Robert Cain who's the philosopher, and here he is. And I guess what I want to show you here is that many of the philosophers on my website and scientists have their very first reference to go to a Wikipedia page to find them, okay? But quite often, a search will yield my webpage, The Information Philosopher. I'm very happy to say that I've had well over 1 million visitors to The Information Philosopher, and quite often Google thinks that my page is kind of comparable in importance to the Wikipedia page, and you often don't find anything like a Stanford Encyclopedia page because they're relatively specialized. Another philosopher I'm going to talk to you about in my first few lectures is at Brown University, a great philosopher on the philosophy of mind, Jaegwon Kim, and here you see he is listed as being philosopher of mind. I'll just go and take a look at him. And here he is on Wikipedia, the first entry, and here he is on his place at Brown University, and another one reference to his work at Brown, and finally a reference to my Information Philosopher webpage. And let me just jump into that page for just a moment to see how I typically handle people. Kim and I both graduated in 1958. Him from Dartmouth University, although he's now at Brown, and me from Brown University. And his particular subject is the mind-body problem. And the mind-body problem is perhaps the most important problem that I've worked on for many decades, although my first published work was in the area of free will problem, the problem of free will and determinism. I hope to show you that I'm really arguing new thinking about them from the same perspective of the notion of information being something that is not actually material. Information, the data we have in our computers, the organization of ideas in our minds is a physical thing, but arguably it is not a material thing. Our ideas are embodied in the arrangement of our neurons somewhere in this huge, complex set of connections inside a brain. Some think it's just a computer. I certainly do not think it's anything like the primitive but very powerful machines that we use to compute. The brain is embodying the information, but the mind is that information itself in the abstract. Information that I could take out of my mind, I hope, and send to your mind. And it could then be embodied there. It could be in the arrangement of the material of your brain and be something you can recall later. One thinks of the great distinction between hardware and software in a computer. The hardware is made up of electrical signals running over integrated circuits and powered by energy and so forth, that without which you cannot put information into a computer. You couldn't put data into something unless it was organized to store it. But the program is something that can be instantiated in many, many computers. You know, the Mac OS or the Windows system runs in many different pieces of hardware, just like ideas could go from mind to mind, and huge numbers of people could be thinking more or less the same things. Interestingly, it's probably very unlikely that any two people think exactly the same thing down to the last tiny detail about any particular subject. But that's a question we'll get into. I would like to just say a few words about my lectures, which will appear on the web. I'm hoping to do them 5 days a week. My wife says, "Are you really at 81 years old going to go back to working 5 days a week? Isn't that too much, too strenuous, too difficult to arrange all the information, the ideas, the problems that we're going to be talking about?" And I remind her that elementary school and high school teachers spend a 5-day week, many hours on each day. I'm only going to be talking to you for 1 hour each day for between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock. My local public access station in Cambridge, Massachusetts, CCTV, has taken an interest in these lectures and thinks they would make good material to broadcast over our cable in Cambridge. I might even connect it to cables in adjoining cities like Boston and Brookline and Belmont, Somerville, Newton, which would be great because then I'd be able to be seen on a station that isn't really seen that often. The public access stations are not viewed as frequently, obviously, as popular news and entertainment stations and the 1,000 other channels on our cables and DirecTV and so forth. But by reaching people in the Boston area over the cables, I may get to meet a lot of people who will be interested in my work and interested in coming to my studios in Cambridge. I mentioned at the beginning that I have what I call an iTV studio, and the iTV for me stands for Internet Television. Basically, that's what today is my webcasting over the internet, rather than going over a cable, which are wires inside a few cities, or even satellite television, or the original form of broadcasting, which is to say electrical signals sent through the air from antennas to television sets or radios originally. The world is really rapidly changing so that the transmission of information is almost all, the major amount, going out over the internet. And when you have a cable program, you can be seen by a whole city. When you have a broadcast, you can go to a large number of nearby cities, each of which might have their own cable company. But when you use the internet to send sound, text originally, then sound with things like blogs, podcasts that actually could let you listen to a speaker. Back in 2003, the very first podcast was actually produced in my lab here in Cambridge, working with Christopher Lydon, who's the host of a very popular national public radio program called The Connection, which came out of WBUR here in Boston. He then left WBUR and Boston University, came to Harvard in the Berkman Center, where he wanted to restart his audio program career using a blog, which did not at that time support audio media inside the blog. And so Dave Weiner, the great developer of early blogging, and was at Harvard for a couple years, and he had set up the very first faculty blogs. He gave one to Christopher Lydon and suggested that Christopher come talk to me about adding audio to a blog. Dave Weiner wrote what's called the media envelope that allowed you to take audio files like MP3 audio files, which I helped Christopher to record, 55 programs, interviews with people all over the world. We then converted to MP3, and Dave Weiner added them to Chris Lydon's faculty blog, and those came to be known as the first podcasts. But where podcasts were sort of like a, how to describe it, limited to audio initially, and basically what's called on demand. That is to say, in order to listen to a podcast, you go to a website and click and download a previously recorded podcast. It's called on demand as opposed to live television. So my ideas in recent years is that I would like to support people getting involved in live streaming over the internet. So iTV is meant to be live TV, the kind of thing that you want to do for sports or important, unique events, which are best seen live, and a week later they're of relatively little interest. So my webcasts, I think I'd like to use the term webcasts rather than podcasts, emphasizes the notion that they are live events. However, as you know, my work is on knowledge that is on my website, meant to be no particular time and more universal knowledge and problems we will always be thinking about. So my webcasts will be kept online when they're finished and available on demand, so that eventually, as I produce more and more of these over the years, I hope to assemble different series of lectures into online courses. And what I particularly have in mind is that I'll have a series of lectures that more or less relates to the 3 books I've already written. And my 4th book, which I'll just pick up here for you to see, is not the Great Problems book, but a book on Albert Einstein. I'm halfway through writing this book, and I'd like to tell you something about my books. They are available in print, as you can see here, but they're also available as PDFs on my Information Philosopher website. And that's a very important thing to me. I'm lucky enough that I do not need to make money from my books. Others depend on that for their income. I do not. And so all of my books are, let me go back to the bio for a moment, find the information, my website, the Information Philosopher, and if I just go to the home page again, you'll see that down the right-hand side, I talk about the existence of my books. So here is the book on free will. Here is the 2nd book on Great Problems in Philosophy, and here's the 3rd book on metaphysics. And if I just click to this site, you see my free will book is available as ebooks, which some of you might enjoy. They can be downloaded and put into various ebook readers, but they're also available chapter by chapter. So here's the preface, here's the introduction, and so forth. If I was to click on the introduction, for example, it should take you immediately to a PDF copy of that chapter of my book. So that means you can study it yourself, read it yourself without owning a print version. And if you're a professor or lecturer in philosophy, you can assign a chapter of the book or specific pages. The page numbers of these PDFs agree exactly with the book. And you can do that without having to spend any money. Okay, it turns out I'm overrunning my time a little bit here. I was waiting for music to play to say I'm at the end of the show, but I'm now at 57.5 minutes. My future, a total of 57 minutes, so that those who broadcast over cable or so forth are able to put in a few minutes of a break between shows. So for now, I'll say goodbye. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope you'll want to be with me as we discuss several great problems in philosophy and physics. Thank you very much, and goodbye. I'm going to turn off my streaming. Stop streaming. Stop